Hi everyone! Today we're going to learn about growing media, or potting mix. That's what you need to grow a plant indoors in a pot, or in a greenhouse. Potting mix, or growing media, is essential for growing healthy plants indoors. Because we learned already that what happens in the roots is essential for plant growth. Because soil, or growing media, which is what we use in pots, holds nutrients and water essential for plant growth. Healthy growing media means a healthy plant. Have you ever heard the expression, that person has a green thumb? That means that they're really good at growing plants. But as we've learned in these videos, it's more than just having a skill or not having a skill. You can work towards having your own green thumb, being good at growing plants yourself. It's about understanding the different requirements that plants need to grow, such as the amount of light, the amount of water, the amounts of nutrients, and the type of soil different plants prefer. Different plants are adapted to different environments, so making them grow can sometimes take some research on that particular plant. Today we're going to talk about the media component in growing plants in pots. After today's lesson, you will be able to list the common materials found in commercially available potting mixes. You'll also be able to describe why the use of peat moss is controversial. And you'll be able to explain how to make your own growing media or potting mix, including how to manage the pH and nutrients. Indoor potting media, or the plural form medium, is any material used for rooting or potting plants. It performs the same function that soil does. It supports the roots, it's a reservoir for moisture and nutrients, and it allows airspace essential for plant growth. It can be a mixture of many different ingredients. Most commercially available media sold in stores has no soil at all. We're going to talk about the common ingredients in commercially available media and also discuss how you can make your own. So why do we use media, or potting mix, instead of soil when we grow plants in pots? Well, soil is extremely heavy, so if this pot had just soil in it, it would be extremely heavy and very hard to transport. The ingredients that we use in media also allow for large pore spaces. When you're growing a plant in a pot, it's very vulnerable to compaction because you're moving it around your house a lot, and when you set it down, it's compacting the soil in the pot. That's stressing the roots out. If it's soil, it compacts very easy and is going to harm the roots and eventually make it that the plant can't grow healthy. So it's important that we use media because it's less vulnerable to compaction. The loose structure of media also lets the water drain well. It's very easy to overwater your pot and kill your plant, so that's why it's important to have drain holes in your pot and something underneath. This pot has a built-in underneath area for water to be caught. It's important so that the water can drain easily through the media. Media that we use is also usually free of pests, and that can help. The media that we use for indoor plants or plants in pots, when we purchase it or we make it ourselves, is usually disease-free. That's important because we don't want our potted plants getting sick. Let's talk about the common media components. First ingredient, which is in the highest volume and is most important, is organic matter. Organic matter is plant-derived material for water absorbing and for holding capacity and nutrient holding capacity, or cation exchange capacity. We learned previously that organic matter has a high CEC. It's able to hold on to nutrients very well. The second ingredient, which is also very important, is coarse aggregates. These improve drainage so that the water can get through easily so that your plant does not get waterlogged. The angular shape, or the irregular shape, of the coarse aggregates allows water flow. The last ingredient is soil, which holds nutrients and supplies nutrients to the plant. Soil naturally has a lot of nutrients, so you can reduce the need for fertilizer input if you add soil. The first type of organic matter that we're going to cover is peat moss. Peat moss is dead fibrous material formed when mosses and other living organisms decompose in a peat bog. I'm going to show you a picture of a peat bog in just a second. In its raw state, it can be bought in mats or bags. It's light brown and it has a stringy texture. It's also commonly available shredded or milled so that those fibers are broken down, so it's more easy to mix with other ingredients. Peat moss comes from peat bogs, natural areas that have essential roles in our ecosystem. The thick layers of peat moss hold lots of water, so they prevent flooding in surrounding cities. These areas, when harvested, are drained and then dried out, plowed, and then the peat moss is vacuumed up and then sold. This destroys the ecosystem that the peat bog once was. Sometimes after harvesting the peat bog, it will be restored. However, it takes generations to restore the ecosystems back to the populations it once was. Let's review what a peat bog is. It's a wetland where dead plants accumulate in waterlogged areas. When those dead organisms die, they're then going to start their decomposition process. The decomposition, however, happens at a very slow rate because there's a low presence of air, because it's waterlogged so often. So the rate of decomposition is very slow. It takes a long time for peat moss to form, so for the organism moss to die and then decompose and then more to grow and then die and then decompose. So the growth or the accumulation of peat moss in a peat bog happens so slow, only about 1 millimeter in depth every year. Since the process is so slow, peat moss is not considered a renewable resource. To learn more about how peat moss is harvested and how they restore the peat bogs after harvesting, you can watch this video. The use of peat moss is controversial because peatlands have so many essential roles in our ecosystem, such as mitigating climate change. Stored carbon is very important to mitigating climate change. About 30% of the world's soil carbon is stored in peat bogs. These are really important places that are holding a lot of the world's carbon. When you harvest a peatland, it makes that area extremely vulnerable to fires since there's so much carbon stored and it's used to being full of water. When it gets dried out to be harvested, it can be a huge fire hazard. A lot of people have died from fires in peat mines. Peat bogs are also full of biodiversity, which is really important to preserve. When you harvest a peat bog, it increases the risks of floods in surrounding areas. Peat moss is, however, very helpful for growing plants. It's harvested, dried, and used in the US and Canada in enormous quantities every year. It's sold as Canadian peat moss, spaghetti peat moss, or just simply peat moss. It's often the main ingredient in many prepackaged houseplant mixtures, often around 50% of the volume of the medium. This is not sustainable. It does, however, hold a large volume of water without packing down, and when it's dry, it's very fluffy and lightweight, meaning it's easier to transport for the companies. It does provide the roots with the ideal combination of moisture and air. The pH of peat moss, however, is quite acidic. It's too low for most houseplants, so usually something to increase the pH will be added to peat moss. If peat moss is allowed to dry out thoroughly, it's really difficult to re-wet, as the water just runs off the peat moss fibers. It must be re-wetted gradually, so if you have peat moss that's completely dried out, you should try bottom watering, or watering the plant from below so that the water can soak up into the pot slowly over time. Because peat moss is so controversial, let's go over some alternatives so that we don't have to use peat moss anymore. The first one we'll go over is coir fiber. This is a byproduct of the coconut industry. Coir fiber is the outer husk of the coconut. Cocoa peat or cocoa coir peat is usually sold in bags, bales, or discs. Cocoa peat expands 3 to 9 times its compressed volume when it's wetted. So that's why it can be sold as discs. Once you add water, that little pouch will expand to a larger area and you can use it to grow plants. Cocoa fiber does not have the water repellent issue that peat moss does. Coir is a tropical product, so in some areas it's hard to access without long-distance shipping. The next type of organic matter that we'll cover is leaf mold or composted leaves. Leaf mold is made of partially decayed leaves and twigs. It's dark brown and has a flaky texture. It holds water and nutrients very well. although not quite as well as peat moss. It can be made at home for free by composting fallen leaves from deciduous trees. You can gather up these leaves from your yard or your neighbor's yard, and then you can compost them in these easy-to-make contraptions. Simply put chicken wire in a circle and fill them with deciduous tree leaves. If you want the composting process to go even faster, you can grind the leaves with a leaf blower before you put them into these circles. After about 6 to 12 months, these leaves will compost, and then you can use them in growing media. The next organic matter that we'll cover is humus, or peat muck. This is actually a soil type found in low-lying areas. It's because twigs and leaves and roots have decomposed in that area, and that has formed organic matter. It's black and fluffy and has a fine powdery feel when it's dry. It's commonly available as garden peat or Michigan peat. It is not peat at all, so don't confuse it with spaghetti peat. Muck continues to decompose rapidly when it's used in a potting media. Its fineness can sometimes cause an aeration problem, so you'll want to add a coarse aggregate. Let's take a minute to compare humus and peat. Humus is newly rotted vegetable material. It tends to be mainly neutral to slightly alkaline pH. Peat, as in peat moss, on the other hand, can literally be hundreds of years old and is usually acidic. Both of these form from decomposition, but the humus decomposed in the presence of air, so it happened faster. The microorganisms use the air and decompose the organic matter. Peat, on the other hand, was formed under low O2 conditions, so the decomposition happened very, very slowly over time. The next organic matter that we'll cover is bark. It's shredded or ground bark, and it's occasionally used as an organic ingredient into potting media. This is a potting mix that I recently bought at the store. As you can see, there is bark in this mixture. These bark pieces can cause some issues, and I'll cover why that is. Some potting mixes that are readily available, such as this is a different one, have actually a lot of bark inside. You can also see that there's random twigs in here and some bigger pieces of bark. I do not recommend the use of bark in potting mixes, and I'll explain why. The microorganisms in the soil are decomposing organic matter. When they do that, they need two main ingredients for their diet. They need nitrogen and carbon. When the microorganisms are trying to break down bark, they run into an issue. They don't have enough nitrogen to do the decomposition process. So what they're forced to do is steal nitrogen from somewhere else. They may steal nitrogen from the plant. Nitrogen is an essential nutrient for plants to grow. So if the microorganisms are stealing the nitrogen, that can be bad for plant growth. If you do have a potting mix that has bark in it, you need to add extra nitrogen fertilizer. The common trees that are used are fir, redwood, pine, hemlock, and oak. Using bark from cedar and walnut can contain toxic substances. Bark holds less water and has a higher pH than peat moss. Some bark has been shown to be mildly antibiotic, so it can reduce fungal growth. Next, we're going to cover hydrating gel granules. These are really cool little beads that you add to water and then they expand a lot. These are really fun and are readily available in many stores in the US, sold to children because they're so fun to play with. But they can actually be used in growing plants because they can hold 10 times their weight in water. Hydrating gel granules are synthetic acrylic copolymers, and you can mix them into your potting mix. Hydrating gel granules are especially useful in potting media for ferns and similar moisture-loving species. Some species of plants suffer serious damage or die if they dry out, so these hydrating gel granules can help you prevent that. A cheap alternative to using hydrating gel granules is using the inside of diapers. You can buy diapers and add water to them and then scrape out the insides and use those gels in your potting mix. Watch these videos to learn more about how to do this. The next thing we'll cover is coarse aggregates that are used in making your own potting mix. Our first coarse aggregate is sand. Sand can be used in pre-mixed potting media. However, it's not commonly used because it's so heavy and that can hurt the companies with shipping costs. But if you're making your own growing media, it's a good ingredient to use. Perlite is something that many plant growing media companies use because it's very lightweight and it's a coarse aggregate, so it helps the soil drain. It's made by heating volcanic rock until it expands, and then you grind it up into these irregular shapes and then use it in potting media. So you have the rock, you have it crushed it, and then you have it expanded. This is what perlite looks like in a potting media. You may have wondered before what these little white dots are. It's perlite. Perlite is a volcanic glass, SiO2, that has relatively high water content. Perlite has the unusual characteristic, just like popcorn, of expanding and becoming porous when it's heated. Perlite expands 20 times. Expansion occurs when the glassy lava rock is heated to 871 degrees Celsius, and the water molecule trapped inside the rock turns into vapor, causing the rock to expand. Same as popcorn. Smallest little seed, put it in the microwave, and it expands quite a bit. Perlite tends to float to the top of a potting media because it's very light. Perlite has been proved to contain levels of fluoride that are toxic to some houseplants. Rinse the perlite that you use 3 times before you add it to your potting mix. Avoid perlite-containing media for the Liliaceae family, as this family is very susceptible to fluoride injury. This is a picture of perlite compared to vermiculite. Vermiculite is made similar to perlite, but it's a mica-like mineral. It's shiny and silvery brown color. It's also lightweight with a spongy feel. When you touch perlite, it's more crispy, can kind of, if you squeeze it hard enough, it'll break. When you touch vermiculite, it's more like a spongy feel. It's neutral to slightly alkaline pH in the range of 7 to 7.5. It has a lot of potassium and magnesium in it. It's an active part of the media because it contains these nutrients. It has a very good capacity for holding water and nutrients, and individual particle size facilitates good drainage. So the particle size is large, sometimes irregular, so it allows drainage through it. Vermiculite tends to compress and lose drainage enhancing capacity with time, or when it's watered frequently. What I mean by that, if you use it over time, it kind of flattens out and becomes less useful. So scientists use vermiculite a lot to grow plants, but they usually only grow it for the plant for a few months, and then they toss out the vermiculite. It's not something that holds up for a really long time, especially if it gets dried out. Another coarse aggregate that can be used is charcoal, although it's not used very often. So far, we've covered the use of organic matter and coarse aggregates in media. Now we're going to cover the third and final ingredient type, which is soil. A lot of commercially available medias do not have soil. So can we add our soil if we're making our homemade media? Yes, but you need to be strategic with what type of soil you add to your media. When you add soil to your media, you want to add loamy soil if possible. Loamy soil, as we covered in the soil lecture, is a well-balanced combination of basic soil particles, sand, silt, and clay. It has a little bit of each, so you get the best of all worlds. It holds water well, and it does not pack or crust when it's dry, and it can be easily crumbled in the hand. It's an excellent potting media additive, even in relatively large quantities, but it should never be used alone in a pot because it will compact. Loamy soil is a rich topsoil found in many successful gardens. So why would you not want to add clay or silty soils? These types of soils are not as well balanced as loam. You can add sandy soils to your mixture if the sand is coarse enough to act as a coarse aggregate. But it's really important that you remember not to use beach sand, because the sand from beaches has salt in it, and that will kill your plants that you're trying to grow in your pots. Now that we understand the main ingredients in potting media, you can make your own do-it-yourself potting media. Why would you want to do this? Well, buying mixes from the store is much easier, but it can get very expensive. Also, companies that make potting mixes do their best, but their bottom line is increasing their profit. So they make sure that their ingredients are usually light in weight to save costs on shipping. This isn't necessarily the best for you or your plant's needs. Buying pre-mixed potting media becomes expensive if there are more than just a few plants in your home. Pre-mixed media are often formulated for eye appeal, so they look really good, and for their shipping costs, rather than plant growth. They can be composed heavily of dark, rich-looking humus, but lack essential aggregates like sand. Composition is determined largely by availability of ingredients in the area and their relative costs. So in your area, you might be able to make your own potting mix for relatively inexpensive. When you're making your own homemade potting media, it's important to think about composition. We learned about main ingredients today. For example, we covered many different ingredients of organic matter, examples of things you can use for coarse aggregates, and examples of things that you can use adding soil. Let's go over some ingredients that are readily available and usually quite low costs. Leaf mold, you can make this yourself from the leaves of deciduous trees, or you can get composted or bagged humus. This is an excellent substitute for spaghetti moss, which is controversial and not a renewable resource. Aquarium gravel can be used as the coarse aggregate, or crushed charcoal, cinders, or sand from a gravel pit or lake. Remember, don't get your sand from the ocean because that has salt in it. Perlite and vermiculite are also useful for your homemade potting media. However, these tend to be more expensive. You can also add soil. The best type of soil to add is loam. You may need to alter your pH of your homemade media. For example, you might want to test your pH and make sure that it's suited for the plant that you're growing. Many potting media formulas call for additions of small amount of powdered dolomite limestone to reduce the acidity of the mixture. Limestone can also contain quantities of calcium and magnesium, which can help your plants grow. Limestone is quite inexpensive to purchase. You also might want to increase the fertility of your soil by adding the fertilizers or making sure that the organic matter that you're using is high in nutrients. You can also use other organic fertilizers such as bone meal and dry manure, which decompose slowly and release their nutrients into the potting media over time. You can also use synthetic fertilizers, specifically the slow-release ones, which will release the nutrients over time for your plants. You can mix those in with your media, and that will help your plants access those nutrients as their roots expand into the pot. Incorporating fertilizer is optional, and you want to do research on how much nutrients the particular plant you're growing needs. Remember, if you're adding bark to your soil, you need to add a lot of nitrogen fertilizer to offset the carbon. As your plant grows, it's going to use the nutrients that you put into the potting mixture as it grows and gets larger. This nutrients has to be replaced somehow, and so one way that you can do that is adding fertilizer to that plant pot over time, or you can repot the plant in a larger pot, adding more fresh soil that will have more organic matter, which will break down slowly and release nutrients to that plant. It's important to replenish the nutrients so that the plant continues to grow healthy. Today we covered how to make your own growing media and the common ingredients found in media that you can buy at the store. The three main ingredients to media was organic matter, coarse aggregates, and soil. After today, I hope you're able to list common materials found in commercially available potting mixes and describe why peat moss is controversial and the alternatives to using peat moss. I also want you to be able to explain how to make your own growing media, including how to manage pH and nutrients. I hope today was helpful and gave you the confidence to make your own growing media so that you don't have to continue to buy it from the store. I hope that you have fun and that you're creative and that you do research on what's available in your area. Have a great day.